Okay, let's go over how we construct a lined or tailored patch pocket with an optional flap. It is going to be applied to a sample piece, a hypothetical jacket front. We're going to use a combination of hand stitches and machine stitches to do this. And you're going to need about 1/8 of a yard of wool or whatever material you are making your garment out of, and some lining. It's really not a lot. 1/8 of the material is generous. This is all the lining we're using, and you need a little bit more for the self fabric, but that's it. Some interfacing, and your patterns need to be drafted. Okay, so let's begin by introducing the pattern pieces. All right, so we have our patterns here. The files to draft these, the tutorials for them, are in the details below. That's totally arbitrary. This is a standard pocket size, but you can do whatever shape or size you like. If you want to do oversized, just apply those measurements to the drafting steps. If you don't want to do a curved edge, or if you want to do a curved edge on your flap instead of a square edge, that's totally up to you. So I have my patterns here just because it's easy to refer back to them to make sure that I'm working with the correct side. Make sure you're working with the right side up, and check your fabric out. The wool, a lot of times, it doesn't have a wrong side. If you look closely, you really can't tell a difference. Sometimes you can, and make sure you're using the right sides of your fabric. So we have a self, that is going to be the actual body of the pocket. We have a flap, so both of these have a self and a lining. I've interfaced both of my pieces already for prep, so this would actually be the good side. The flap is already interfaced. I have notches, corresponding notches on all of these pieces. And I also have my sample piece that I'm going to be applying the patch pocket to. So let's begin with our first step. I have my 2 pieces of the body of the pocket right here facing upward. The good sides are facing upward. So I'm going to place the lining on top of myself, good to good. And that means my notches are going to be matching up right here. And all we want to do is construct this first seam. And how we're going to do that, whatever seam allowance you build into your patterns, I have a 1/2 inch. All we need to do really is secure the 2 layers with a single pin in the center. You can do 2 more on either side if you like. And we're going to close this up. We need to leave the center of this open though. So you're going to stitch from the edge to about here, and then also from here to the other edge. So we're leaving this center piece open so we can later flip this piece right side out, and it'll make sense in a little bit. So I'm going to stitch this real quick and then we'll carry on. Now we're going to press all of our seam allowance up toward the lining. After pressing, your piece should look like this. So again, good to good. We're going to now bag out our lining and self. And to do this, we just pull our lining down to meet the bottom edge of our pocket self. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because this is our built-in 1/8 inch turn of cloth. So we sort of have to force the lining to meet up with the edge of the self piece. If we don't line this up perfectly, we won't have a turn of cloth. So it's important not to let the fabric do what it wants to do. You need to force it to meet exactly to the edge. So begin by pinning your 2 layers in place, and I like to do this by even distribution, meaning I start in the center, I move to the side centers, and then equally pin from there. After pinning your piece, it should look like this. This is your header coming down, folding down. Let it do what it wants to do. Your seam is flat in there after ironing, but just ensure that it's fully extended and laying flat as it should be. If you're a seasoned sewer, you can take this right to the sewing machine and stitch it. Remember to put the bigger side of your project on the bottom, because that's how the feeder dog helps evenly distribute the extra of the bottom. So always put your bigger piece that you're trying to fit into a smaller piece on the bottom side when you're sewing it on the machine. If you want to take some extra care with this, you can diagonal baste it in place before you stitch it. So I'm going to do that just for example's sake real quick. Now all along, while I'm diagonal basting these two layers together, I'm making sure I'm double checking that these two edges are meeting exactly at the same spot. I don't want any overlap of either of the edges. Okay, once you finish your diagonal basting, it should look about like this. Your edges should be perfectly meeting each other. You've forced that extra 1/8 of an inch that's built into the self to meet up to the smaller lining. And you should have a little bit of bagging in the back, in the self piece. I didn't put any back tacking with my diagonal baste because I'm just going to take this right to the sewing machine and stitch it down. So remember, bigger piece on the bottom side when you're feeding it through the machine. Start at the very top. Be sure to back tack a good amount to secure this top edge. Go around at your seam allowance, which mine is 1/2 inch, and again back tack when you finish at the other side. Okay, here's the machine stitch done. Be careful around the corners. Take your time to ensure that you're getting a perfect curve so you can match exactly on both sides. This determines the shape of your pocket. So take extra special care and slow down when you're doing this curve. Now you can take out your diagonal basting stitch. Some of these might be a little more difficult than others, so it might take a second. They might be caught in your machine stitch, but just take a moment to get rid of those basting stitches now. Now we want to trim our seam allowance around this curved edge to 1/4 of an inch. Our next step is to iron this lining upward. We're just separating this itty bitty seam allowance now, so the seam is very crisp when we turn this piece right side out. So iron this lining upward. Our lining is turned upward, should look like this. Now we're going to have a crisp turn at our seam. So now you're ready to pull your project right side out through this hole that we left at the header, where the header meets the lining. So just carefully turn your project right side out. Okay, so the ironing of that seam, that last step, did some of the work for us, but you need to make sure that your pieces are fully extended to the actual seam that you just stitched. So roll the two layers together until you feel that it's fully extended outward toward the edge of the seam. And then at the corners, you can pick it out with a straight pin. Okay, this is our tailored patch pocket. Now, see how the self is turning over towards the back so we don't see the lining at all. That's our turn of cloth. We need to make sure when we iron this down in the next step that it is proper and appropriately positioned. So it should look about like this on the entire edge, okay? You can ensure that it stays like that with another diagonal basting stitch all the way around before you press it, or you can just take extra special care when pressing it right now so that it's exactly where you want it to be. Make sure you don't have any weird angles or points. This should be a really nice smooth curve. So go ahead and press it down, and then we'll talk about how to apply this onto the project. So fully pressed, this is what it should look like. You should see a clear turn of cloth around the entire edge. It's okay if this lining gets a little bit wrinkly, if there's a little bit extra real estate where you're trying to feed it into the center to get more turn of cloth, that's okay. We're not going to see this at all. The more important thing is that you have this clear turn of cloth. So everything is hidden into the wrong side when we apply this to a jacket. The last thing you need to do to finish this piece is close this up with a quick slip stitch. So very easy, just close this up with a slip stitch. We're also now going to be applying this piece to our sample or the actual garment that we're putting this on. So to do that, you need to have your pocket position ready. So here's mine. So I'm just going to center this and pin it right in place. So even on the line and centered. So double check that everything is even and positioned correctly. You don't want any askew pockets on your piece. And now we're going to take a slip stitch and do the most inconspicuous stitch that you can do. So the top corners of your pocket, this sees a lot of tension and wear. So you want it to be really secure, even though it's just a hand stitch. So what I like to do is once everything is properly positioned, you know exactly where everything is, everything's pinned down really well, go to the square or the corner that you want to start at. So for me, I'm starting at the right top corner, and give yourself some back tacks. And remember, there are two ways to secure the start and finish of your thread for hand stitching. One is to create a knot beforehand in the actual thread, and the other is to back tack by picking up very little pieces of the fabric. So 2-3 yarns in the same area locks it in. And where I'm placing this is exactly where the corner is going to be on top of, so I can hide it really well. And I want it to be very, very secure, so I'm doing about 3 or 4 movements, 3 or 4 little stitches right there. Now you can start your slip stitches. So all that did was secure the end of your stitch, right? But I need to also make it that the top of my slip stitch area right here is really secure, because I haven't even connected the thread to the actual pocket yet. I need to make sure that this pocket is very strong right here, at least for a hand stitch, okay? So with a slip stitch, all you're doing is traveling through the tunnel of a fold and then coming out of it, picking up some fabric, entering back into the tunnel, coming back out, picking up some fabric. These stitches should be small, no bigger than 1/4 of an inch, and very consistent. Now the way you want to apply this pocket, you want to secure this top edge, the face of your pocket, to the actual sample or garment fabric. You don't want to take this layer, the bottom layer, and secure it down, because then you'll see this seam. We're trying to hide this. It's supposed to look like magic. How is this pocket being held on there? So I've got my back tack secured at the top corner. I'm going to enter into that top corner tunnel right there. And I'm using that top layer of the pocket. Now double check that your pocket is still laying exactly where it should be. And once you've come out of the tunnel, you can secure that stitch down to the actual sample fabric. And I want it to live pretty much hidden. I'm not going to put my stitch outward, like out in the open, but I want to sort of sandwich it in between as much as possible. So I'm going to pick up some of the fabric that's a little bit underneath the pocket. Okay, straighten out your threads. And now to secure this top corner, I'm going to do double slip stitch. So that means after picking up that little stitch through my garment or my sample fabric, I'm going to go back in that tunnel the opposite direction. So where I started, I'm going back through there just so I can give extra strength to this very top, okay? That is where the most wear happens. I guess it's technically 3 slip stitches because I'm going forward, backward, forward. So 3 slip stitches are living right there. Now I can continue with my stitch. So again, I am trying to pick up material that is sandwiched in between the pocket and the garment. Keep on checking that the placement of your pocket is right before you secure your stitch down, and travel through the tunnel of the top layer. You want it to be close to the seam though. You're taking from that self layer, but you're not taking from the top. You are close to the lining. You're just using that turn of cloth that should be underneath there. You should be sewing from that turn of cloth, okay? And that's going to hide the lining. So travel through the tunnel of the turn of cloth close to the seam where it connects with the lining. When you complete your slip stitching and you're on the other side, you're at the very end here, you can finish off by again doing double slip stitch. So come to the very point and then go back with another slip stitch, come back through the tunnel to the very top, the very corner, and secure it down directly where you want that corner to be at on your garment. And then you can do a tailor or a back tack inside here because everything needs to be inconspicuous. Open this up and hide your back tack right here so no one can see it. And again, it's just 3 or 4 little tiny stitches in the same area just to lock it in there really good. All right, and that is the finished application of your patch pocket to a sample or a garment. Now, I want to show you real quick the difference of stitching from that top layer, how it should look next to your face of your garment or sample that you're sewing it to, versus if you were to stitch it from the bottom side, you're able to see that seam right there. You shouldn't be able to do that. So that's why you're stitching, traveling through the tunnel of the top layer and securing that down to the other piece of fabric, okay? Now you have your patch applied. You can stop there if you want. That's perfectly fine. You could even do a top stitch. You can do it in addition to this slip stitch, or you can apply a patch directly to a garment with a top stitch. Now that's less of a tailored look. This is considered tailored because it's hand done. It takes more time. It's just a finer finish. But if you do want to put a flap on there, remember this is the same way we constructed this patch pocket is the way we put together these two pieces for the flap. We have our self and our lining. It has a turn of cloth. I did it the exact same way I did this. I distributed the extra self material into the smaller lining piece. I clipped that seam allowance to 1/4 inch. I pressed the lining upward so I separated my seam allowance so that seam gets really crisp and nice. Turned it right side out, pulled my corners out. Now, before applying this to the actual garment, you have to do your top stitching if you're going to do that. So this is the time to put top stitching on there. Personally, I think top stitching needs to be on both pieces if you're going to do it, because it looks sort of out of place. You sort of want to see top stitching on this piece as well, but that's personal preference. So I have my top of my flap basted together, so when I'm applying it to the garment, I know that these aren't going to slip around. They are staying exactly where they need to stay. Your flap is meant to be a little bit bigger, just a slightly bigger measurement than your pocket itself. It's supposed to fully encompass the pocket. So this is barely bigger than the pocket. Maybe I stitched too big of a seam allowance on the flap, but it is patterned slightly bigger. So just know your flap should be just ever so slightly bigger than the pocket so it covers it fully. Now to get your flap onto your garment, we have this nice clean edge right here. We're going to start by putting our flap good to good on the sample, upward like this, because it's going to live eventually like that, right? So we want to start like this. And all you do is butt the edge of your seam allowance, the top of your seam allowance for your flap, right to the pocket opening. Make sure it is centered and pin in place. just like this. You can baste it in place if you want, or pin it. Make sure that it doesn't move around when you're pinning it or when you're stitching it. It's very obvious when a flap is off center. Okay, so your project should look like this now. And all we're going to do is machine stitch this at a 1/2 inch. So 1/2 inch away from this flap top edge. So about right there. Here's our machine stitch on our seam allowance with our flap butted right up to the pocket opening. You can remove your basting stitches now and trim this seam allowance of your flap to a skinny 1/4 of an inch. So it's close to an 1/8 of an inch. You don't want to get too small because then it sort of starts to jeopardize the construction, but you want it small enough to where your top stitch is going to encompass that itty bitty seam allowance now. And what I mean by that is that we're going to flip this down now and iron it to where it sits perfectly and nothing's pulling weirdly. We're gonna just press this down really nicely, and then we're gonna top stitch it at a 1/4 inch width right here. So theoretically that little seam allowance will get caught and encompassed in that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then when you lift this flap up, no one will see anything. Okay, here's our finished pocket. You definitely want to fold this flap down in a way where it's not pulling the base of your garment or sample, so you shouldn't see any tucks or weird tension here. Allow it to fold how it wants to fold. So you shouldn't see your seam allowance in there. It's all nicely finished, right? And that is how you do a tailored patch pocket. Optional flap, optional contrast top stitching. Yeah, there you go. So good luck.